They say the spirit of a generation is etched in its creations, that the soul of a society can be found through its art. If this is true, then let me ask you, what does modern art suggest about the age we inhabit? Recent paintings seem to possess undertones of sadness. Video games have recently embodied darker and darker themes. And music has quickly taken a turn toward the dystopian, with the cyberpunk genre quickly gaining popularity. I wish I could say this was just evolving taste, but often, when shifts in the culture occur, it signifies a deeper underlying need, one that has failed to be met. And that's what I think modern art has been trying to express, a yearning for something, perhaps a cry for help. Either way, it shines light on a problem that needs to be solved. Entropy is the measure of disorder. It is a law in thermodynamics that measures the unusable energy in a system. But as a signal of disorder, it has recently found a place in psychology as well, now used to describe negative emotions as a marker for the descent into disorder. I bring this up because it seems as if our culture has embodied the markers of entropy, something that started in 2012. Since that time, there's been a sudden and very large uptick in the amount of mental illnesses diagnosed every year. And unfortunately, it's not just depression. Rates of schizophrenia have increased by 67%. Anxiety is up by 134%, and ADHD has increased by 72%. So what on earth happened? Well, two key areas offer some insights. The first one lies in the defining psychological issue of our era, anxiety. Fear is arguably the most important emotion for survival. It's so important that the mammalian brain can trigger a fear response before visual information is even processed. But once that threat is over, the alarm stops ringing, stress hormones stop flowing, and the feeling of fear subsides. Anxiety, however, is very different. While fear triggers in response to the moment of danger, anxiety triggers when a threat is perceived as possible. It is a healthy response, especially when in a potentially dangerous scenario. But when hypersensitive, to the point where it gets activated by things that pose no real threat, it keeps us in a perpetual state of distress. This is how healthy temporary anxiety can turn into a disorder. However, the clue lies not just in how anxiety works, but more so in when it is experienced. One advantage that comes from our larger brains is our social groups, and because of the integral role community played in our survival, we've evolved to be just as attuned to social threats as we are to physical threats. As an example, those aged 18 and younger often fear social death more than physical death, a crazy statistic if you think about it, but still a good indication of what's going on. Since the 1990s, the world on average has gotten safer, but in that same time period, our relationships have deteriorated, which taken together points toward a social dilemma. Alone, this might not seem like much evidence, but when paired with the second clue, things start to make a lot more sense. The surge in anxiety is primarily found in Generation Z. The digital era came in two waves. The first wave occurred in the 1990s in the form of personal computers and access to the internet. But during the following 10 years, there was no uptick in mental illnesses. And in fact, millennial teens who grew up in this era were actually happier than their Gen X counterparts. The second wave, however, tells a very different story. This wave saw an increase in the usage of two things: social media and, more importantly, smartphones. While teens in the 1990s had phones, smartphones are an entirely different animal. They connect you to the internet 24/7, they can run millions of apps, and they quickly became the home of social media platforms, which can ping you constantly, urging you to check out what everyone else is saying or doing. This kind of connectivity, while it has its benefits, is nowhere close to as beneficial as talking directly with people in person. And we can see these effects in the beginning of the smartphone era. In 2010, most teens who wanted to access social media had to do so through a computer, which limited access. But it wasn't until Gen Z got smartphones that they could be online all the time, and now they are. Thus, the introduction of the iPhone 4, which took place in June 2010, is what really started this trend. It was the first phone to possess a front-facing camera and made it easier to take selfies and videos, which is relevant because in that same year, Instagram was launched and quickly grew from 10 million users in 2011 to 90 million by 2013. Suddenly, it was as if Pandora's box was opened. Life was changed forever, for everyone, and the smartphone social media era, as we know it today, was born. Imagine for a second what it would be like if you fell into a deep sleep on June 28, 2007, the day before the iPhone was released. You wake up 10, maybe 15 years later and take a look around. The physical world would look largely the same, but the people would be behaving very strangely. Nearly all of them are clutching small metal rectangles. Anytime they stop moving, they stare at this thing for who knows how long. There's an eerie quiet in public places. Eye contact seems rare, and deep, meaningful conversations have been replaced by quick surface-level exchanges. This might sound crazy, but this is what I imagine the beginnings of a dystopia to look like. It would start by fracturing the key to our evolutionary success, our communities. In the book Robot Ethics by Mark Kokelberg, he talks about how ending something is, psychologically speaking, easier at a distance. He's talking about drones when he brings this up, emphasizing how using autonomous robots to fight our wars for us would make ending lives easier. There would be no guilt, no eyes you would have to look into before delivering that final blow. And while his book is about robots, I can't help but draw parallels between what he says in social media. We've been trained to judge people as quickly and publicly as possible, something that creates this obligation flywheel, as those who don't participate will be judged for not condemning today's chosen target. If you try to forgive, your team will brand you as a traitor. Even a small mistake can bring heavy costs in a viral world where content lives forever. Something that made us forget there are people on the other side of the screen. It's obvious to anyone who spent more than a couple months on social media that it's a much nastier, more confrontational place than the real world, showcasing how distance really does breed a level of indifference. In a strange way, it reminds me of Kurt Vonnegut's short story Harrison Bergeron, or Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Both stories are set in a future America where individuality is suppressed. Anyone who stands out in any way is punished for being different, which is enforced through an extreme version of conformity. This is relevant because the constant threat of social death is doing the same thing to us. Here's an interesting fact. Humans are the only animal whose adolescence lasts longer than 10 years, which is odd. If evolution is all about maximizing survival, shouldn't we get the reproduction phase out of the way as quickly as possible? Well, no, because roughly 3 million years ago, culture started influencing our evolution. To give you an example, as we began using fire to cook, our food became easier to chew and digest, which led to a reduction in the size of our jaws and digestive tracts. Following this change, survival was no longer determined by who was the fastest or who was the strongest, and instead shifted to who was the best at learning, which is the defining trait of human beings, our ability to learn from each other. Again, circling back to this idea of communities. Because of how long it takes to learn, it became maladaptive to reach puberty as fast as possible, and instead provided humans with an extended childhood that allowed for a longer period of accumulating knowledge. A kind of cultural apprenticeship, rewarding those who excelled at imitation and those who chose the right people to imitate. Gene culture coevolution has identified many of the strategies that have become ingrained as a result of this shift. And the two most relevant for us are conformist bias and prestige bias. The value of conformity is obvious. Doing whatever most people are doing is the safest strategy across the widest range of environments. It's particularly valuable when you're a newcomer in a society. So what happens when a kid, say in 2015, goes from middle school to high school and discovers that most of their classmates have an Instagram account? It makes them want one too. And once on Instagram, they quickly learn how most of the people they follow use the platform, which in turn makes them use it that way too. In real-life social settings, it takes often weeks to get a good sense for what the most common behaviors are. But on social media, you can scroll through 1,000 data points in 1 hour, each one accompanied by evidence in the form of likes and comments that showcase whether the post was a success or failure, effectively creating the most efficient conformity engine that has ever existed. Of course, that's just how people start to conform. It doesn't even touch on what they're conforming to. Social media's god is engagement. What matters is your attention, how long you watch, what makes you click, not what you're watching or whether it's good for you. In hindsight, it was so obvious which type of content was going to perform the best, I'm surprised we couldn't see it coming. It's the content that appeals to our most primal instincts. And because who we choose to imitate is just as important as if we imitate, young people are often focusing on, for lack of a better word, people who may not be the best role models. Those who gain the most likes and comments, which distort our sense of what is perceived as valuable and worthy of attention, creating a drive to mimic the behaviors that garner the most online popularity, even if those behaviors are destructive. This is the prestige bias. The major work in this field was done by the evolutionary anthropologist Joe Heinrich, who found that humans have a social organization centered around prestige, which people willingly grant to those they see as competent in a valued skill, such as hunting or storytelling. Of course, we do perceive excellence for ourselves, but it's more efficient to rely on the judgment of others. If most people say Frank is the best archer in your community and you value archery, you'll look up to Frank, even if you've never seen him shoot an arrow before. There's no doubt in my mind that tech CEOs in Silicon Valley knew what they were doing when they directly targeted this psychological system. It's why Facebook introduced the like button and Twitter introduced the retweet button. Both of these innovations made viral content propagation possible. And with the ability to quantify the success of every post, an incentive was created for users to craft each post for maximum spread. Sean Parker, one of the first executives at Facebook, admitted in a 2017 interview that this is exactly what he was doing, with the goal of creating a social validation feedback loop, exploiting a vulnerability in human psychology that has been disastrous for us. On social media, the ancient link between excellence and prestige can be severed more easily than ever, and it has been. But I don't even think this is the worst thing to come out of social media. Anytime something is wrong, it's very easy to focus on misery, on comparing yourself to other people, what they have that I don't. But there's another element that's talked about far less frequently when discussing dystopia. What happens when we live in excess, when things are too easy and there are not enough struggles? Let me start by asking a question. What would happen if we overdosed on joy? We Happy Few is a game that tries to answer this question. Set in a dystopian world where the population is controlled through a drug, negative emotions are suppressed to give way to a utopia, one where no one would ever have to experience any of the pesky emotions of anger, sadness, or grief. Of course, as a result, happiness is not the outcome. Instead, a false sense of euphoria results in addiction, manipulation, memory issues, and a loss of genuine control. Essentially, the game is a meditation on the consequences of escapism, which is interesting because 62 years earlier, a study was conducted on this very theme. The Universe 25 study is probably the most controversial experiment to ever exist. Conducted by John B. Calhoun, he tried to answer the question of what would happen if a society had everything it could ever want, if all our needs were always met. In this study, 4 breeding pairs of mice were placed inside a utopia. The environment was designed to eliminate the problems that would lead to death in the wild. There was unlimited access to food, water bottles, nesting material. The weather was always kept at 20 degrees Celsius. On top of that, there were no predators, no diseases, no fights. And at first, everything seemed to be going great. Things progressed quite pleasantly. The pairs began to reproduce and the population doubled every 2 months. However, when the population peaked at around the 20-month mark, things took a turn for the worse. It started when dominant mice controlled mating rights. In the wild, when a male mouse loses a bout for the right to mate, they would just go somewhere else and start over. But because there was nowhere to escape to, the mice that lost these fights would just form large coalitions, gathering in the center of the utopia, fighting senselessly and sometimes even resorting to cannibalism, even though there was access to food all around them. The dominant mice who at first controlled access to mating began to tire from the constant challenges, and eventually they failed to defend their territories. This left nursing mothers vulnerable to invaders, forcing them to neglect their young. They then abandoned their offspring altogether and sometimes even resorted to killing them. For the pups that were lucky enough to survive, they were poorly socialized and struggled with adult interactions. Maladjusted females then isolated themselves, while some males lost interest in breeding and began to obsess with their appearance, eventually forcing themselves onto the previously dominant mice who just didn't seem to care anymore. All of the behaviors soon spread across the entire population, and by month 22, new births ceased altogether. Eventually, Mouse Utopia collapsed and the population never recovered. There are obviously a lot of contentious points in the study, with one of the most debated being its applicability to humans. And while I do think this argument has a point, there is one scenario where the study can serve as a powerful warning: the dangers of escapism. In Universe 25, the mice were provided with everything they could ever need: food, water, ideal living conditions, and so on. And yet, by solving all of their problems, this perfect environment created an escapist fantasy, a world devoid of the natural struggles that give life meaning. The same concept that's explored in We Happy Few, where the drug joy creates an artificial sense of happiness that disconnects users from reality. And throughout the game, I could see this stark contrast. When on joy, the game is vibrant, colorful, and full of life. Streets are clean, people are smiling, and everything has this dreamlike aura of perfection associated with it. When off joy, the color blinds are suddenly removed and you can see the world for what it really is. It's bleak, dark, and dirty. The buildings are crumbling and the environment is polluted. A juxtaposition that makes its message clear. Escapism, while temporarily comforting, ultimately leads to a more destructive disconnection from reality. Social media strikes me as a sort of rat utopia as well. It's inescapable and has found a place in all our lives, whether we want it to or not. It's full of behavioral sinks and often a place people go to escape their circumstances, to tell everybody how great my life is even though I'm depressed. And on top of all that, it creates a cycle of addiction. In the game, when characters go off joy, they endure severe withdrawal symptoms, which are very lifelike. The characters experience paranoia, anxiety, and irritability, something I'm sure those addicted to social media have experienced before. Just like in the Universe 25 study or the game We Happy Few, social media creates an environment where the escape from reality can lead to deeper issues. But do we actually use social media to escape? Humans can find meaning in a lot of different ways. I think it's one of the things that differentiate us from all other animals. But when stuck in an artificial fantasy where all your needs are always met, why even bother trying? The most heartbreaking thing to come out of all of this is what I call the failure to launch. There are many reasons why someone can fall off track, why they would stop searching for employment, cut off all social connections, and hide from the rest of the world. But of all the reasons, the most unfortunate is the Hikikomori. Japanese society has long placed intense pressure on the younger generation to succeed. Go to school, get a job, conform to the social expectations of those around you. In the 1990s, when the bubble economy of the 1980s popped, the hurdles to success became significantly harder to overcome. As a result, many young men retreated into their childhood bedrooms and just shut their doors. As hardships diminished their chances of finding a place in the world, the new internet made it possible for the first time in history for young men to meet their needs alone in their bedrooms. And so, they began pulling inward, living like a hermit crab, emerging from their caves only at odd hours when they were less likely to run into anyone, even family. Anxieties were calmed by staying inside, but the longer they stayed inside, the less competent they became in the outside world, which created a vicious cycle, fueling an anxiety that created a sense of hopelessness, a feeling of being trapped. For many years, this was thought to be a uniquely Japanese phenomenon, but since then, it has spread all across the world. In past generations, those who retreated into their bedrooms would have been confronted by an unimaginable loneliness, a boredom that would compel most to change their ways or find help. Today, however, there's no need. Millions of online worlds are just vivid enough to keep your mind from starving. 10 years later, you can still find entertainment by watching pornography or surfing the web all night. And the worst part is, it kind of makes sense. Why be ashamed of this lifestyle? Compare it with the working lives of other young people who are told what to do all day by somebody they probably don't like. You can do whatever, whenever you want. The room is the opposite of a prison. It is freedom. But it's not, is it? It comes with a huge cost. Imagine for a second a childhood where all risk has been eliminated. Nobody ever felt the rush of adrenaline from climbing a tree or the rush of butterflies from mustering the courage to ask somebody out. Essentially, a human version of Mouse Utopia. In this childhood, there would be no bruises, no broken bones, no broken hearts. It might sound like a safe world, at least initially, but at what cost? Is this something you would want for yourself? I'm willing to bet most people would say no, and yet somehow, something close to this is how most of us were raised. A world with too much supervision and not enough risk-taking. One of the most widely noted traits about Gen Z is that they're not doing as much of the bad stuff that teenagers used to do. They drink less alcohol, have fewer car accidents, and get into far fewer physical fights. These are, at first, good trends, right? I mean, it's not like anybody wants more car accidents. But because the rate of change for so many risky behaviors has been so rapid, I don't view it that way. What if these changes came about not because we're getting smarter, but because we're withdrawing from the world, because we stopped caring, because we don't see a point anymore? From the beginning of the digital age, the tech industry has found ever more compelling ways of getting the younger generation to do the things that they want to do, without having to take the risks that were once needed to satisfy those desires. And as the culture of safetyism emerged, the virtual world stepped in as a sort of savior to fulfill the needs our culture had eliminated. Unfortunately, in a terrible way, not by giving us the skills that can help us move through life, but instead by giving us an escape, a way to quit. And I worry about what the next step is. As generative AI personalities improve, an increasing number of men may find that the Hikikomori lifestyle is worth it. Why bother getting a girlfriend if I have to face the risk of rejection when I can just build an AI girlfriend for myself? Why would I go on an adventure with my friends when I can replace real-world exploration with video games? Emil Durkheim noted that the more tightly people are bound to a community, especially one with strong moral authority, the less likely they are to commit self-harm. When coming to this conclusion, he was concerned that the modern world, with its rapid and disorienting changes, would weaken the grip of traditional communities, and as a result, create the opposite of a liberated society, one that feels anxious, one that feels lost. That is what I think has happened to us, what is continuing to happen to Gen Z. We are less able than any generation in history to put down roots in the real world, turning to escapism as a result. And I think this is also why, in the late 2010s, purpose and meaning became such a large trend, why boys and girls began to agree with the statement that life often feels meaningless, and why in our culture, technology has become associated with emptiness. At the beginning of this video, I talked about the zeitgeist, and how through our art, games, and music, we can take an inside look into the mood of our times. And in doing so, the conclusion that I've come to is, modern society has lost its spirit. We no longer find value in what we once did. We no longer have goals that give us meaning. And the resulting crisis has been expressed through our art. When everything moved onto smartphones in the early 2010s, everyone saw a huge increase in the number of their social bonds, connecting people more than ever before. But as a result, the number of real friendships has declined, as the effort required to make a deeper connection has been replaced by the attention needed to maintain all these new superficial relationships. In music, we can hear this. Genres like cyberpunk have a clear melancholy tone associated with technological advancement. Artists like Billie Eilish or Juice WRLD captured the alienation a whole generation felt growing up in the digital age. And games like Cyberpunk do a great job of showcasing the disconnection that comes from a genuine loss of human values. This is the great irony of our times. The more we immerse ourselves in social media, the lonelier and more depressed we become. Which is funny, because many crises in our lives have a long unconscious history. Often, we move toward them unknowingly, step by step, unaware of the dangers accumulating in the background. Which brings me to the last piece of media I want to use to make my point. Science fiction is the place scientists go to dream, but often, nightmares emerge as a result, and the electric state is no exception. In this dystopian world, the main character travels through a hauntingly beautiful yet desolate America, where society has crumbled under the weight of its own technological advancements. The landscape is littered with remnants of a once thriving civilization, now overrun by VR addicts who forgot that their physical bodies matter. The world is in a state of decay, everything is abandoned and desolate. And the worst part is, the few survivors that remain keep themselves blind to it by hiding in their digital worlds. Because of that, everything they experience is fake, much like on social media today. Because interactions are often one-to-many, every post has to be strategically crafted, highlighting our best sides while minimizing our worst ones. On top of that, everything is asynchronous. Because every relationship is superficial, it's easy to let go of people to meet new ones. So as soon as someone does something that makes you angry, it's easy to just remove them from your life instead of trying to work through it. Which creates a powerful trap. We superficially satisfy the drive to connect with other people without actually connecting with other people. This, I think, is the core message of the electric state. Quick fixes have resulted in a generation of people who can get their most primal needs met without actually getting those needs met. The escapism that's enabled by merging technology with the real world allows us to run away from our problems instead of facing them. But when we do this, it's not like our problems go away, they just fester, get bigger, and stay in the unconscious, causing turmoil until we find a way to address them. And because we don't, they escape into conscious thought through other means, usually through some form of creative expression. And that is why I believe technology and its advancement has come to be associated with emptiness. I'd like to finish off this video with a more personal touch. When I started this channel 7 months ago, there was only one reason why I could get myself to sit down and write. I wanted to show people that evolutionary biology is a much deeper field than often credited for. But as I began researching, I realized that the true value can be found when mixing evolutionary biology with other disciplines. And it doesn't just have to be science, which is why I want to finish off with this point. Durkheim, who I brought up earlier, argued that Homo sapiens could just as easily have been called Homo duplex, or the two-level man. And that's because all of us exist on two very different levels. At the beginning, we spend the majority of our lives pursuing our individual interests. He called this the realm of the profane, which means the ordinary day-to-day world, where we are very concerned by our own wealth, health, and reputation. But in his research, He found that nearly all societies have created rituals and communal practices for pulling people up onto another level, one where the self recedes and collective interests predominate. Examples of this can include Christians singing in church or Muslims circling the Kaaba in Mecca. The value of this practice can be found in the fact that these two levels are available to everyone, even those outside of a religious context, such as when fans of a sports team sing chants to unite before a game. Durkheim called this the state of energized communion, and I think it's the best insight to come out of sociology. Strong communities don't just magically appear when people are around one another. They need something to bind them. They need something to give them a reason. Ultimately, this is what I think social media has taken away from us, our communal bonds, which brings me back to why I started this channel and the reflections at the beginning of this video. The darker undertones in the creative expressions of our culture point to a yearning for something that goes beyond individual achievement. And I think it's a cry for purpose, for meaning, which is why in this series, which will probably be the most important one I ever make, I'll try to tackle this topic. Until next time, cheers.